Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. Nothing, perhaps, is more readily associated with the Vikings than the longship, or longship, which they used, or the horned helmet, which they didn't. But say Viking, and everyone instantly sees an image of ships with ferocious-looking dragon heads on them, and men in horned helmets rowing furiously and then leaping off them to raid and pillage and burn things on a massively nasty scale. That's partly true. They did use ships to raid, though they were no more brutal than anyone else at the time. They just did it with more style. But the helmet part, well, now that's pure fiction. That's a 19th century romanticism getting in the way of historical accuracy. A real Viking helmet would have been, well, it would have been something like that one. No horns. But as to the ships, it's fair to say that without the longship, the Vikings would never have existed. Since to be a Viking in the first place, a ship and somewhere to go with it was required. And not really just any ship. A bulky, slow cargo ship crawling along at a few knots from port to port really didn't make you a Viking in the strict sense of that word. A very specific type of vessel, constructed for fast arrivals and often even faster departures, was what you needed to be really a proper Viking, not just a trader or a merchant. Without the longships, we would never have heard of the Vikings, because quite simply, they would never have existed as such. They would just have been the inhabitants of Scandinavia, the Danes, the Norwegians, the Swedes, people no more important or interesting really than anyone else at that time. So, first we must ask, what was a Viking? The term Viking is used so often as an interchangeable word for Scandinavian or Norse, but it isn't. We weren't a Viking, or Vikinger, as it was in Old Norse, by nationality. We were a Dane, a Swede, or a Norwegian. The term only applying to those who went off in a ship somewhere, principally raiding and being a pirate, if you like. Like Viking really meant a pirate. But exploring, trading, or colonizing could count as well if you went off somewhere in a ship to do it. So you could not be a Viking, but you could go Viking. It's the same as, well, let us say a German who is hiking through the Black Forest. He or she isn't a hiker by nationality. That's not going to be on their passport. They are still German, but they are going for a hike. Nor was the ship a Viking ship. It was just a ship in which some men and occasionally some women were going Viking. It was just a ship that was carrying people who were going Viking. The shippiness of the vessel, if you want to put it that way, was unchanged by who happened to be sailing in it, or indeed where they were sailing to. And of course, not every Dane, Swede, or Norwegian ever became a Viking. Many people never having left their farm or village, never even setting foot in a ship. Some people who lived inland, well, they'd probably never even seen one. While others would have done it on a regular basis, going out raiding during the summer months and then returning for the winter and resuming whatever trade or occupation they normally did, or even wintering in Britain or Ireland in the fortified riverside camps known as Longfart or Longports. And a few, of course, would have done nothing but raiding, getting their income entirely from the spoils of plunder. But to see every Norseman as an armed raider bent on pillage and plunder and burning things is woefully wrong. It'd be a bit like seeing all Scotsmen in kilts, every German in lederhosen and funny little hats with the arse end of a badger on them, or all Americans in big white cowboy hats. It's important to bear in mind that the Scandinavian peoples had used ships long before the so-called Viking Age, which is usually dated as beginning in the year 793 AD, with the first real Viking raid, to the west at least, destroying the monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, or Lindisfarne as it is today, in the kingdom of Northumbria, and ending in 1066 with the death of King Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Both events, oddly enough, taking place in England, though Viking activity had extended across all of Europe and as far as the Middle East and even North America. But of course, Norse ships did not suddenly appear, as if by magic, in the year 793. Oh no, there we are, Viking ships everywhere. No, there are remarkable rock carvings in Scandinavia that date back to the Bronze Age, and they depict ships with high curved prows and sterns, very similar in shape to our idea of a Viking ship, though they were more like canoes and probably used for trading purposes. Nor did the various types of Norse vessels vanish in a puff of smoke in 1066. They were still used long after that date, even for occasional raiding, though that gradually died out. But the Bronze Age rock carvings do show that shipbuilding had been practiced in Scandinavia for centuries before the eventual emergence of the legendary longship. Methods of construction had been improved and honed to perfection. Navigational skills had been refined. Centuries of expertise had been built up. The first proper boat that we know about is the Hjortsping boat, dating from the Iron Age circa 400 BC. Very, very similar in appearance to the Bronze Age rock carvings, some 62 feet long, and seems to have had a crew of 20 using paddles. The first of what could really be considered a longship is the Nydam boat, the first boat we know of that was rowed rather than paddled, and it was slightly raised at both ends, made in Denmark circa 350 AD, but not strong enough to have carried a mast. And in fact, sails don't ever seem to have been used until the 8th century, when ships were built with strong enough frames to support the weight. Around 700 AD, the first proper keel was devised, found in the Kvalsund ship. And the keel, of course, is the actual base of the ship on which everything else rests. And that was a vessel large enough to carry passengers and crew out to sea. Techniques found in these early vessels were refined and carried over into what we call the Viking Age, which culminated by the late 8th century AD in the awesome longships as we know them. Perhaps the finest vessels ever made for their intended purpose. Ships that would carry the Norse people across most of the known world, from the Middle East to North America and pretty much everywhere else in between. The advent of these ships allowed expansion on a scale impossible previously, both in terms of trade and of raiding. Raids as well as tribal conflicts had occurred previously, of course, but mostly to the east, to lands lying close by around the Baltic or towards the Slavic regions, and easily reached overland or in small boats. But these amazing new ships, well, they expanded the ability to reach other lands that lay far out to the west, across the open sea, and raiding began on a scale hitherto impossible, as of course did trade and settlement, which very often went hand in hand. The era of the famed dragon ship had arrived. Now, the ships could be owned by an individual, usually a king or a reasonably wealthy jarl or chieftain in the case of the warships, or well-off merchants or traders in the case of cargo vessels, or they could be owned by an entire community, a town or village owning them rather than an individual, and the ship being used for the benefit of the whole town. In time of war, the king or the local jarl could commission them, and thus assemble a suitable naval force without actually having to keep it on standby. They dispensed with the need for a standing navy. The longships, when they were used in warfare rather than raiding, normally acted in a troop transport role rather than as warships proper, not engaging in actual naval battles, as had the Greek and Roman galleys, or would the great battleships of the 18th and 19th centuries. When they did go into full battle, they were usually tied together to form a secure floating platform for the warriors to fight on, with perhaps just a couple of ships left free to harass the enemy or sail around behind them. That type of battle, it was really land warfare conducted at sea, which does sound a bit odd. Not a naval battle as such, where ships would maneuver around one another, firing things at each other or try to ram or board. Now, very large fleets of ships were used to carry considerable numbers of warriors on what were more than just little coastal raids, as for example when the crumbling Frankish Empire was attacked in the 9th century. Viking ships sailing deep inland up the Seine and other rivers, sacking Rouen, among other towns. 129, ships are recorded as sailing up the Seine in 845 AD and attacking Paris. And in that same year, no less than 600 Danish vessels attacked Hamburg. King Canute the Great was said to have had over 1,000 ships when he sailed to Norway in 1028 AD. Now, as I mentioned already, not all Norse ships were those we think of as longships, the so-called dragon ships. Now, this would be most people's idea of a Viking ship, designed for war, with a fearsome dragon or sea serpent head on the high raised prow, sometimes on the stern as well. Shields hung along the side, with a big square sail and a bank of oars, with men rowing furiously, ready to leap ashore and plunder. But before we get to the almost legendary longship, let us have a quick look at those other Norse vessels, ones that didn't scare the shit out of towns and villages across the coasts of Europe when they appeared on the horizon 1,000 years ago. At the bottom end of the scale was the fairing, a small open boat with 2 pairs of oars, the name being Norwegian and meaning for oaring. The sort of boat used in and around harbours, useful to bring people or goods out to ships lying offshore. Small boats like that, well, they'd have been common in every harbour. They could have been used for fishing, of course, as well. Then there were specialist heavy cargo vessels, ships that relied on sail power alone when at sea, with just a couple of oars used only for manoeuvring in harbour. The Knorr, for example, an ocean-going vessel that came in various sizes, which we know from wrecks that have been found. A small coastal trading ship was some 45 feet long and 11 feet wide, with a load capacity of about 4.6 tons, and probably carried a crew of 5 or 6 men. Then there were the ocean-going ships, something like 54 feet in length by 15 feet wide, with a cargo capacity of some 15 tons, and of course a larger crew, and able to make about 6 knots under good conditions, which was roughly 7 miles per hour. And they would be used to transport people, livestock, and general goods over quite long distances. Knorrs travelling to and from Scandinavia to Britain and Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, briefly probably to Newfoundland and New Brunswick as well. Another cargo ship was the Bearding, a smaller, light freight carrying vessel, faster and more manoeuvrable than the larger and much heavier Knorrs, some 40 feet long and 11 feet wide, and relying on oars as well as the sail, unlike the sail-driven Knorr, and having anything up to a dozen oarsmen. Ships that were light enough to be easily pulled ashore, small enough to access towns that lay very far inland on shallow rivers, and used for fast transport of merchants and goods. It would have been smaller ships like these that would have been employed for much of the river trading undertaken by the Norse, when, for example, they travelled from the Baltic via various river systems down to the Black Sea and Constantinople, and on other similar trips, using rivers like the Volga and the Dnieper, where porting the ship overland from one river to another was often required, something that would have been a pretty daunting task with a big Knorr. Though even then a fairly large crew was still required, both to physically move the ship overland and to stand guard against robbers who might be lurking nearby, waiting for just such an opportunity. Few Scandinavian harbours seem to have had any kind of jetty or pier. Only 3 so far have been found to have any indication of a proper landing stage of any kind. That's Birka, Kopang, and Hedeby. Also, Hedeby seems to have had wooden posts driven into the harbour, where ships could tie up, presumably for small boats like the fairing, to ferry the cargo ashore. Other harbours show signs of stones that were laid, sort of causeways, which suggest they were used at low tide to perhaps even drive wagons out to the ships. And given the fact that cargo ships, like the longships, had quite a shallow draft, it's likely that they were usually simply run up onto a convenient beach at high tide and then settled as the tide went out so they could be loaded or unloaded as the case might be and then just floated back off at the next tide. The same in estuaries and tidal rivers where the ships could go in at high tide, gently settle on the bottom as the tide went out, and then sail out again on the next high tide. Now to the longships proper. Vessels intended primarily for war rather than peaceful trading, like a little model here. Not that that's to say that longships didn't go on purely peaceful expeditions on occasions. They would have. Not all longships were the same. They varied considerably in size and ability, from quite small raiders to huge vessels intended to impress by their sheer size, such as King Olaf Tryggvason's Ormurlangi, the Long Serpent, which may have been 100 feet long and had over 30 oars. And some ships were used for both war and trading purposes. There were, by the way, actually doubts at one time as to the accuracy of the tales of these giant ships, such as King Olaf's. But at the end of the last century, wrecks were discovered of just such vessels. And now there are reproduction ships of that size which go to sea regularly as tourist attractions. Now, as I've said, ships could be used for both war and trade. You could use even the largest longship simply for coastal trading if you wanted to, if it wasn't needed for anything else at the time, like during the winter, for example, when raiding was seldom undertaken due to the weather conditions. And I'm sure many men used their longships for trading or transporting goods when they weren't needed for other purposes. Though, of course, cargo vessels, well, they were completely useless for raiding purposes. They were too slow for a fast approach and dangerously vulnerable to any vessel that might try to intercept or pursue them. But All Norse ships, regardless of their intended purpose, shared a superb seafaring technology and understanding of what was required for their needs, resulting in the finest ships of that era, and indeed some of the finest ships ever built by any nation in history for their intended purpose. The longship, in its most famous role as a warship and raider, was, well, to put it quite simply, perfect, able to navigate shallow rivers as easily as the open sea, or run right up onto a beach due to its low draft, able to reverse direction almost instantly in an emergency, since it was the same at both ends, the rowers simply turning around and rowing the other way, which was very handy if you started being attacked from the riverbank, perhaps as you were going up a river. And it was very fast, with maximum speeds of anything from 10 knots, which is over 11 miles per hour, up to 15 knots, roughly 17 miles an hour, depending, of course, on sea conditions, if there was a headwind or a strong following wind, as well as the oars, and, of course, the rowing ability of the crew. Obviously, the men could only row for reasonably short periods if they were pulling hard, and that would only have been done when coming in on a raid or in an emergency. Of course, if they used long, slow strokes, it's thought they might have been able to row for perhaps 2 hours or so. The Norse actually played a form of tug of war to improve their rowing skills. A couple of men might sit and put their feet together, for example, each pulling on the end of a short rope. But the movements were similar to that of rowing, developing those muscles, and probably a good way of deciding who were the best men to take on your voyage from a rowing point of view. Ivar and Olaf play tug of war. Ivar collapses, gasping after a couple of minutes, while Olaf is fresh as a daisy. So, of course, you take Olaf and you let Ivar go back to shoemaking or whatever it was he did for employment. There's a Norse skeleton that was discovered here in Dublin, and a woman from the National Museum examined the muscle attachment points on the arms, which showed that the man had considerable arm strength. The particular details of the attachment points indicating a circular motion of the arms, as would be the case in rowing. Now, he probably had a punch like the kick of a horse. The longship could strike quickly and be gone before any real defence could be organised. And no town or village that lay on a river more than 3 feet deep was safe from it, no matter how far inland that might be. That was demonstrated very clearly here in Ireland, with Viking raiders penetrating deep into the countryside, attacking towns that probably considered themselves quite safe from seaborne raiders, and then often branching out on foot or on captured horses into the surrounding areas, often striking towns and monasteries that lay some distance from a river where no one would have considered any seaborne danger. In the year 837 AD, for example, a jarl named Soxolfa took 60 ships up the rivers Liffey and Boyne, going a considerable distance inland with some 1,500 men. In 845, Thorgesta penetrated deep inland, sailing up the River Shannon to Loch Ree, where he established a fort, having sacked the wealthy monastic settlement at Clonmacnoise on the way, and then going overland to Loch Lean, where he established another strong point, and an island, incidentally, in the latter, still bearing the Latinized version of his name, Tegesius Island. And he did the same further north on Loch Ney, where again he established a fort. And then there was Håkon in 847 AD, using the rivers of Ireland once again to his advantage. In continental Europe, the Franks were astonished at first when Viking raiders arrived 100 miles or more inland, along rivers that were considered quite unnavigable by any seagoing vessel. And the shallow draft had another advantage, in that it could beach easily. It could be pulled up onto a riverbank. There was no great problem with that. And when the ship ran aground, the men knew there was no more than 3 feet of water under them, and it was perfectly safe to jump overboard. Even if wearing heavy chainmail, they were in no danger of drowning. They didn't have to check how deep the water was. The ship goes thud, you jump. You know, I'm sure there must have been many little villages along the smaller, shallow rivers who would initially have laughed at the idea of large seagoing ships arriving on their doorsteps. I can picture some local chieftain or village headman just scoffing at the idea. Sure, no, don't be worrying yourselves about these Norse fellas that do be raiding and raping and all sorts of the Lord knows what kind of devilment along the coast. Sure, aren't we 50 miles from the coast? And a little bit of a river you can walk across and keep your arse dry. Sure, it's hardly more than an elongated puddle, so it is. You couldn't get any kind of a ship up here. So we're all perfectly safe, so we are. Don't be worrying. Well, no, they weren't. The depth of a dry arse was all a Norse longship required. And the Irish, as well as many people in continental Europe, would discover that to their cost. And as I said, people who didn't live close to a river that connected to the sea, regardless of how large or small it might be, or whatever kind of ship might come up it, were unlikely at first to have expected an attack from the land by raiders who'd come by sea. Though the Vikings generally preferred to attack directly from water rather than go overland, since quick access to their ships was always a prime consideration. But they did, on occasions, take horses and raid further afield, as Thorgesta demonstrated in Ireland. There's actually a very interesting seafaring connection between the Norse ships of the 8th and 9th centuries and Ireland of the present day, and that is a small boat called a yawl, which is found on Achill Island off the coast of County Mayo. Now, these were originally pointed at both ends, the same as a longship, and they're still built in the distinctive northern European manner, which shipbuilding experts link them directly to those ships that came from Scandinavia over 1,000 years ago. The native Irish took note of the Norse ships, and as they did with other aspects of Norse technology and customs, they copied them, and that has come down to us today. There were different types of longships, as I've said, and they were often classified by the number of oars they carried. And the so-called Gulifing laws of Norway, which came from the annual Althing or meeting held at Gulen, which became the first Norwegian legislative assembly, in fact, circa 900 AD, stated that at least 13 oars were required for a ship to be considered suitable for military purposes. So, firstly, there was the carvi or carve, which would have anything from 6 to 16 rowing benches. And that would not primarily have been a warship. It was an all-round vessel, a sort of general-purpose ship that could be used for trading or fishing, but also put into very effective service as a warship if required. The Gokstad ship, some 75 feet long with 16 oars, dating from the latter part of the 9th century and discovered in 1880, was a ship of that type. Then there was the Snekkja, its name meaning a snake, which would have been the smallest of the purpose-built warships, classed as requiring at least 20 oars. And these ships would have been around 56 feet long and just over 8 feet wide. Very, very long and thin, well, hence their name. They would have carried some 41 men, 40 to row in 2 shifts, and the steersman, with the Danish versions, which were intended for beaches and low-lying coastlines, having an extremely low draft, less than perhaps 2 feet, while the Norwegian version, intended for the North Atlantic, required a greater draft, like the other versions of the longship. It was some 1,200 of this type of ship that King Canute the Great was said to have brought to Norway in 1028 AD. Snekkjas remained in service after the Viking Age, evolving as time went on and eventually becoming far larger and heavier than their ancestors. The Viking version was light enough to be easily beached or even ported if necessary. A small modern version of this type of boat is actually still in use in Norway to this day, called a snekky, and the shape of the hull is clearly reminiscent of the longship. Then there was the skid or slider, which were large warships with 30 or more rowing benches. And ships of this class constitute the largest warships that have ever been discovered. Several ships of this type were discovered at Roskilde in Denmark, when the harbour area was being developed. First in 1962. When a ship built of oak, 98 feet long with 30 rowing benches, able to have carried anything up to 80 men, was discovered. Now, very interestingly, analysis of the wood showed the vessel to be a late-era longship, built in Dublin, circa 1042 AD, and using wood from the Glendalough area of County Wicklow. It's quite amazing what science can do. A magnificent replica of the ship was built at the Viking Museum in Roskilde and launched in 2004. And she subsequently made an epic voyage in 2007, travelling under sail for 1,000 miles from Denmark through great Atlantic waves around the north of Scotland, down the Irish Sea, past the great Viking stronghold, the Isle of Man, and then to Dublin, where she made a rather emotional entry to the city, it must be said, sailing up the River Liffey with her sail billowing in the wind, watched by large crowds on both banks of the river, more than 960 years after her ancestor had sailed in the opposite direction. She was named the Sea Stallion from Glendalough, appropriately enough, and she was lifted out of the water and remained on public display at the National Museum of Ireland until 2008, and she still goes out to sea on occasions. During further work at Roskilde Harbour in 1996 to 97, another similar ship was discovered, a massive vessel, 121 feet long, the longest Viking ship ever found, and dated to circa 1025 AD. Now, then there was the Draka or Dreki, meaning dragon, but no actual evidence for these has been found. We know of them only from the sagas, said to have been very large, ornately decorated, and exceedingly elegant. King Olaf Tryggvason's long serpent being one of these and having 34 oars. Now, it's thought these were simply large versions of the type of ship found at Roskilde in the late 90s, rather than an actual different type of ship. Perhaps they had more ornately carved dragon heads and fancier ornamentation on them, but they would have been roughly the same ship. There is actually a splendid recreated vessel of this type, size-wise, called the Drakam Harald, which has even crossed the North Atlantic, visiting the United States and other places. Excuse me. Now, the Norse became expert at a method of shipbuilding known as clinker, in which the bottom edge of a hull plank overlaps the upper edge of the plank above it, or below it, I should say, giving a rather stepped look to the planks. And these are held together by iron rivets and washers. The rivets will be placed about 20 inches or more apart, so there'll be a bit of a give, as well as another brilliant design feature that I'll come to in a moment, making the hull flexible enough that it would bend and ride up over the waves rather than simply crashing through them and absorbing the full force of a rough sea, which is why the longships could ride out even the often mountainous seas of the North Atlantic. All the more remarkable when you consider how low the freeboard was on a longship. I mean, you could lean over the side and touch the water. There really wasn't very much between you and the sea, unlike most of the medieval ships that came later, which were very high-sided, as ships tended to be for centuries afterwards, like the Spanish galleons, for example, which rose a long, long way out of the water. Not all Norse ships, of course, survived such rough sea conditions, as when Eric the Red led a large fleet to the newly discovered Greenland, and 11 of the 25 ships were lost when the North Atlantic turned unusually rough, though the losses on that scale would have been rare. And of course, we have no idea if some of those ships were old or badly repaired. The finished planking would have been sealed with a mix of animal hair and moss coated in tar, and pine resin may have been used to seal the wood to protect it from weathering and sea creatures that might attach themselves to the hull. And there's evidence that many ships were elaborately painted. When not in use, they would often be beached to reduce damage from being left in salt water, and give a chance to inspect the hull below the waterline and reseal any parts that required it. Now, this method of shipbuilding, superb though it was, wasn't exactly cheap. You didn't get that kind of quality in the bargain basement, since quite apart from the timber required, 11 large oak trees were required for an average-sized longship, and just the keel of the Gokstad ship required a straight oak tree 80 feet long. A considerable quantity of iron was also needed for the rivets. Approximately 330 pounds of iron needed to rivet one ship. And iron was a valuable commodity. We might not think very much of iron today. It's kind of gone out of fashion. But 1,000 years ago, it was extremely valuable. You couldn't just find it lying around on the ground and pick it up. And it was a vital part of everyday life, not just in shipbuilding. So everyone who built themselves a ship would have been reasonably well off. Poor people did not own big ships. Small boats, maybe. Ships, no. Trees were not cut with saws. They were radially split with wedges and mallets and axes. And that actually made them superior for shipbuilding to modern saw-cut planks, because they were split following the grain, meaning they were less likely to suffer from shrinking or warping or splitting. It gave them far greater strength. And many shaped parts required would be cut from parts of trees that had the same general shape. You needed a curved piece, so you cut it from a curved section of trunk. You needed an L-shaped piece, so you cut a section of trunk with a suitably sized branch coming from it. Or a T-shape could be obtained from a section of trunk with branches to either side. That gave much greater strength to the shape required than cutting it and shaping it from straight wood, since once again they were following the grain. Of course, all that could take rather a considerable time. Ships were not constructed particularly fast. King Olaf's ship was said to have taken an entire winter to complete, with quite a number of men working on it under a master shipbuilder. The image we see in the Vikings television show of Floki building all these wonderful ships all by himself is really very exaggerated. Well, simply put, he couldn't have done it. Well, at least not unless Ragnar or whoever he was building the ship for was prepared to wait a few years for it. I laughed at one point when Floki goes off to build a ship, and suddenly there it is. Only weeks have passed, and there is a fully rigged ship. He couldn't even have got all the wood he needed cut in that time just working on his own, when one considers that King Olaf's ship took months to build with a force of general labourers, plank cutters, tree fellers, and stem smiths, as they were called, all working under the master shipbuilder. And these craftsmen had quite a sophisticated set of tools that we might not think of today, including a large adze, wooden mallets and wedges, long bow saws, as well as other types of saws, broad-bladed axes, and other kinds of axes as well, steel files, gouges, anvils, chisels, and assorted types of knives, as well as a twisting drill bit. They were very, very well equipped. Most early ships were made of oak, which was associated with Thor, though over the years the suitable oak trees became scarcer in northern latitudes as they were used for both shipbuilding and other construction purposes. Pine was used quite a bit. And the Norse shipbuilders had a few very advanced skills, such as the keelson, a large piece of wood that straddled the keel that wasn't actually attached to the keel, being fastened to multiple points on the side of the hull. Above the keelson was the mastfish, as it was known, due to its fish-like shape, a piece of wood, a humpback, with a slot in it. And you can actually see in the little model here, this down here is the mastfish. There, it is quite an accurate little detail on the model. And this hunchback piece of wood had a slot in it, into which the mast could be simply slid without having to try to lift it into place. And a large wedge was then driven in to hold the mast in place. This feature is actually quite correctly shown in the model. You can just see the wedge there at the back of the mastfish. Now, the mast was anything up to 40 feet or more in height, and it carried a sail of approximately 900 square feet on average. Obviously very heavy, so sliding it into place reduced the work required, and it could be easily taken down if it needed to be unstopped by simply knocking out the wedge and sliding the mast back out of the slot. It could then be laid on two T-shaped uprights that were mounted fore and aft in the ship, as could the yardarm with a furled sail when it was lowered in very bad weather, for example, when there could be a risk of the sail being blown off, or if the ship was in harbour for some time and there was no point in leaving it up. But apart from the ease of raising or lowering the mast or the sail, the keelson and the mastfish together, attached as they were to various strong points on the ship, spread the weight of the mast evenly onto the hull, keeping it off the keel, which greatly reduced the strain on the vessel structure and prevented any possible collapse amidships, especially if there was a strong wind filling the sail, which would have put considerable pressure onto the mast's mounting and could damage what was quite a lightly constructed hull if it weren't distributed properly. The hull on a longship was surprisingly thin. The planking on the Gokstad ship, for example, was only 1 inch thick, which was quite remarkable when one considers the stresses and the strains put on the ship's hull out in the open sea. There wasn't really very much between you and the Atlantic Ocean or the North Sea, and building methods and clever design was required to make it enough. I mentioned the flexibility of the longship's hull, which was, of course, a considerable benefit in rough ocean conditions, but as well as flexibility, the actual shape of the hull aided in that regard. Modern shipbuilding experts who studied the Viking ships have found that the design of the hull meant that it created bubbles along the edge of the planking as it moved through the water, and that gave the ship what could be thought of as a cushion of air under it, reducing considerably the resistance in the water, which gave these ships an ability to sort of ride on the water rather than down in it. They glided on it, you might say, rather than ploughing through it. Those old shipbuilders, they knew a thing or two. There are many very clever little features on these ships, such as wooden covers for the oar holes, because since they were very close to the water, if they were open when not required for rowing in a heavy sea, for example, or just when the ship was running with the sail only, which they would have done most of the time, then of course water would have been slopping into the vessel through the oar holes. So they devised a round cover that swung up when the oars were required and swung down to cover the hole when they weren't, held in place by a locking piece of wood. And the oar holes themselves had a small thin cutout to one side that enabled the oar blade to be put through it from inside the ship, rather than having to lean out and pass it back from the inside. Since oars on Viking ships went out through the hull, they were not put into like oarlocks on the top edge of the hull, as with later vessels. Nor were the oars all of a uniform length. since given the curved shape of the hull, oars close to the bow and stern were slightly longer than those amidships, so that all the oars would hit the water correctly at the same time in unison. Now, oars were usually made of pine. It was lightweight for its strength, and they ranged from about 17 to 19 feet in length. Anchors were often simply a very large stone set into a wooden frame. Some of those have been discovered, though a metal anchor of the traditional curved anchor shape has been found in Denmark. Ships were steered by what was called a steering board, which was a broad oar, if you like, attached to the right side of the stern. The right side as it was if you were looking forward. Now, this gives an idea of what the steering board would have been like. It was this quite broad oar. It would have been mounted just about there on the stern of the ship. We're not sure exactly how it was secured. Various methods have been tried on reconstructed ships, but probably mounted on some kind of swivel device with leather straps or ropes so that it could pivot. And this was the standard method of steering a ship before centrally mounted rudders came into use. Tests on modern reconstructions of Viking ships have shown this method worked very effectively, and ships could turn quickly and easily, though sometimes quite a bit of strength is required to move the steering board against the force of the water at sea, according to some who use them. But then, having said that, I've also seen women steering these ships and having no problem at all. So presumably a lot depends on conditions at the time. That, incidentally, is where the term starboard comes for the right-hand side of a ship, the side that had the steerboard, while the port side, the left side, is thought to come from ships having had a boarding opening or port on the other side. So they would come in and tie up at a jetty on the left side for easy loading, and also keeping the projecting steering board safe from any contact with the jetty that might damage it. I was looking at a video of one of the recreated Viking ships, the Dakan Harald, actually, which I mentioned earlier, built using the original methods and materials. And she was in heavy seas off Labrador, I think it was, sailing between huge icebergs. And she was riding up and over the waves, sort of a motion something like this, not just crashing into them, moving at a considerable speed and almost bouncing over the water, showing how well these ships could handle even in very bad condition, thanks to the skills of those who built them. Of course, that didn't mean they couldn't fall victim to severe conditions, as Eric the Red found out. There is no such thing as the unsinkable ship or the fireproof building, as many people have discovered to their cost. The sail was often made of homespun wool, made on the same vertical looms that were used to make clothing. And the women would have put quite a bit of work into making one. I mean, you're talking weeks or maybe longer, because of the time and effort required to produce such a large thing as a sail. They were naturally treated very carefully indeed. You couldn't just come back home and ask your wife to run you up another one for tomorrow because you'd accidentally just dropped yours overboard. To protect them from the weather, they would be liberally coated with animal fat and natural oils, which of course, added to all the wool in them, made them rather heavy. And of course they were very large, anything up to some 40 feet or more. There is evidence to suggest that the sails were often striped, as in a little model here, which is doing quite a bit of work today. And that is why so many Viking ships are shown in pictures with striped sails. There is evidence for it, though I'm sure there were all sorts of designs, or even just no designs or colors at all on them. Now, a famous aspect of the Viking longship, its most distinctive feature, I suppose, would be, let us turn to our model again, the ferocious dragon or sea serpent head fixed to the high prow, and sometimes on the stern post as well. That, of course, was a feature of the warships only. It made them look fierce and aggressive. In modern parlance, it made them look booyah. But that wasn't required on trading vessels. While it might make raiding a lot easier, scaring the shit out of simple villagers as you sailed in and hopefully making them run away so you didn't even have to fight them, it would not have improved one's chances of getting a fair deal, or perhaps even being allowed into a harbour if you arrived looking like you intended to kill something. Cargo ships did have the high bow and stern, right enough. It was an intrinsic part of the design, but there was nothing added to it. The dragon heads were also not permanently fixed. They could be detached, and they would have been removed when entering friendly harbours. There was no need for them. Or even if the ship was being used for trading or carrying passengers, the heads would be removed, thus declaring to anyone who saw them they were not warships, they were coming in peace. And also, the crew would not have wanted to frighten or offend the landmatir, the guardian spirits of the land, by such a fearsome gesture as they came into harbour. And it was actually forbidden under Icelandic law for any ship to enter a harbour with the heads in place for fear of upsetting the landmatir. In Iceland, even today, the landmatir are honoured and respected in a way that is quite surprising in our, if I can't see it in a test tube, it doesn't exist, scientifically based world. Though the respect shown them in that country is rather nice, I think. Another famous feature of the longship, we shall return to our model, are shields along the side. Though in reality, they were probably, as a general rule, only displayed in that manner on occasions rather than constantly. Say, for example, when entering harbour to make the ship, well, more impressive looking. Now, it did keep the shields out of the way. There wasn't a lot of open deck space on a longship, and shields were rather large, but in heavy seas, it seems they might have been in danger of being swept away if they were always carried in that manner, which is one reason their constant storage in that way has been questioned. Now, it is possible, of course, that they were secured strongly enough to prevent that. We just don't know. Now, it would have been very handy when coming in on a raid. Apart from making the ship look more dangerous, it would have been very easy for a man to get up from his rowing bench, take the shield, and go over the side. There is a story recounted of a man called Helebjorn Herfinsson, who sailed into a harbour with all his shields displayed in that manner, and he was afterwards known as Skaldabjorn, Shieldbjorn, which suggests that hanging shields along the side was not normal everyday practice, or because it might simply have been that he never did that himself, and he was just showing off on that particular day. We don't really know. Now, since the longship, and trading vessels as well for that matter, all ships of the day, were completely open to the elements, travelling in them, well, it could be lovely on a beautiful summer day, the wind in your hair, the fresh smell of the sea, beautiful. But when a gale was blowing and the waves were like white-capped mountains all around you, the ship was going up and down and sideways all at the same time, and waves were crashing back across the deck, and perhaps everyone on board was bailing water furiously with any container they had to hand to keep the ship from actually sinking, it was decidedly less enjoyable. Now, sometimes a shelter was made by stretching something like a tent over the two T-shaped uprights that carried the lowered yard on. There would have been one like about here, another one here, that the yard could be laid on top of, possibly even using the sail itself. But even that wouldn't have been much use in driving rain that would come in under it. Leather sleeping bags were used by many travellers, and they could double as storage for belongings in the daytime, though using the bags for actually sleeping usually involved simply lying on the deck in any available space. Not that there would have been very much of that with the rowing benches along the sides, or the crew's sea chests being used for that purpose. Food was something that had to be planned carefully, especially on a long voyage, say to Iceland or Greenland, where there was no harbour to pull into for supplies. Things like salted dried meat or smoked fish and meat would have been put aboard, as well as plenty of skin bags of water, and tubs of sour milk might be carried as well. The food on a voyage like that would certainly not have been haute cuisine by a very long way. The duration of a voyage, now that could depend on many factors. The type of ship, the number of people on board, what type of cargo, if any, was being carried, if she had oars or just a sail, and of course, principally the weather. Oars would not generally have been used out at sea. There'd be no real need for them, other than perhaps when skirting the coast and keeping out from rocks or getting past strong currents, or, well, just perhaps giving the crew some exercise and keep them from getting bored. In rough ocean conditions, oars would really add little to a ship's speed for the effort involved. The oars would have been deployed in rivers close into the shoreline, as I've said, when picking up speed, perhaps as wind took the sail, or if there was no wind at all and the ship had become becalmed. And of course, when coming in fast on a raid and making a quick getaway afterwards. When on coastal journeys, ships would have been beached at night to avoid the hazards of rocks or currents that would be invisible in the dark, and to enable cooking fires to be lit. But once out of sight of land, and the safety of a convenient beach to run the ship up onto, weather became all important. Ships often waiting for weeks for suitable conditions. Nautical charts were not used as far as we know, so a clear night was essential. navigating by the stars being the earliest method of finding one's way at night. And the Norse, of course, would have been familiar with things like the constant position of the pole star and the movements of easily recognizable star groups. And clear days were just as important, navigating by the sun. Constant latitude was an important part of navigating across such as the North Atlantic, since if you departed from a point known to be directly opposite to where you wanted to go, and you maintained a constant latitude, well, you would get to your destination. A 12th century text, for example, gave directions on how to reach the southern part of Greenland. You went to Herna in Norway, which is near Bergen, and you sailed west, maintaining constant latitude, and lo and behold, there was Greenland. Other points in Norway were opposite Iceland and used in a similar manner. Iceland, just keep going that way, you can't miss it. Constant latitude could be calculated during the day, of course, by the position of the sun at noon. And there is a possibility that a simple device was used that consisted of a wooden disc with a vertical peg in the middle floating in a pail of water. By observing the length of the sun's shadow cast by the peg, a constant latitude could be maintained. Though there isn't any concrete proof that that was actually used. We do know that the sun's position was noted, sunrise and sunset, and a man named Sterne Oddi drew up a chart giving directions for observing the sun. And some very simple and possibly surprising navigational aids were used that might not spring instantly to mind. Things that would still be known today in some parts of the world where modern technology hasn't totally replaced the knowledge of the old-style traditional seafarer. The old salt, the "Arr, Jim lad, it be smelling like a storm do be doing up. Oh, arr, it's coming. Aye, lad, you'd best get below." That sort of thing. No, old-style sailors, they could kind of sniff out storms. The colour of the sea, the movement of the waves, types of seabirds encountered, and the direction they might be going in, especially in the evening when birds might be returning to their nesting places. And it's said that caged birds would be carried on ships and released when it was thought land might be close, to see which way they went, since they could sense the presence of not too distant land. Whale feeding areas would be noted, or the actual smell of nearby land, the odour of trees and plants. Something that was possible for a Viking who, like many native peoples today, would have had a far better sense of smell and be more attuned to the feel of nature than most people nowadays. If caught in a fog, they would listen carefully for sounds that would indicate land was near, the breaking of waves against rocks or the cries of birds, and probably drop the anchor just as well to be on the safe side. And tall mountains could be kept in view for considerable periods astern, and then others that would become visible in a few days if one was on course. Now, the journey from Norway to Iceland was roughly 1,000 miles, and that was recorded as being routinely accomplished in 2 weeks. Though under extremely good conditions, presumably a strong following wind, it could be done in a week or less. It could also take a month or more under difficult conditions, and ships could be blown completely off course by exceptionally strong winds and end up somewhere else. The only actual navigational aid not involving human senses and acute observation that we know conclusively was used on the longship was the plumb bob, a heavy weight on the end of a rope marked at intervals with knots, which was dropped over the side, and when it hit bottom, they could tell the depth by the number of knots that had gone down. So that is our look at the famous, or indeed infamous, longships. Vessels that terrified generations across Europe and at the same time opened up a trading system far in advance of anything that had existed previously. Ships that made discoveries and broadened knowledge of the world. They brought fierce warriors to raid and plunder, looting and burning, often with a calculated ferocity designed to scare people into running away, but also those ships brought settlers, families who wanted nothing more than lands to farm and were quite happy to live peacefully alongside other peoples and trade with them, even intermarry and later convert to their religious beliefs. Norse shipbuilding technology influenced all the seafaring lands of Europe for centuries after the last dragon ship had rotted away to dust. And even today, aspects of their design are still in evidence in Ireland and Norway, for example. The everlasting image of the Vikings is that ship with the fearsome dragon head on the prow, shields hung along the sides, and huge, hairy men, armed to the teeth, rowing furiously into battle. Oh, they're very romantic, and stirring, of course, but one should not forget the humble Knorr plodding along with everyday mundane cargo. Small trading ships beached at low tide, unloading their goods, or being dragged overland to change rivers on the way to the Black Sea and Constantinople, or the times when longships carried men with their wives and children to new homes far across the sea, to Iceland, the Faroe Islands and Greenland, their fearsome dragon heads removed so as not to frighten the spirits of the land. You know, I found it quite moving a while back to see an anniversary celebration where a number of reproduction longships came sailing into the bay at Anso Meadow, one of the known Norse sites in Newfoundland, just as they had done 1,000 years ago, when Leif Erikson and Thorfinn Karlsefni came to the New World, having no intention of fighting, but rather seeking settlement, and quite prepared to trade with the native inhabitants, though, as it turned out, things went sour later on, due probably to misunderstandings between the two peoples. But warfare was not Leif's intention. Had it been, well, he would have brought a lot more men with him. He didn't really have enough men to fight in had he wanted to. If you have enjoyed this video, well, please like, and you might care to subscribe to my channel. That is a great help, actually, on YouTube. So, please subscribe if you can. And a share would be nice, and very much appreciated, I can assure you. With that, I shall say thanks for watching, and farewell until next time. Bye for now.